Hey everybody, LA Lim coming to you. Another beautiful sun splash day in Los Angeles. Welcome to my YouTube channel, LA Lim, and welcome to episode 3 of my weekly series, The Greatest Albums of All Time. In the last 2 weeks, I featured 2 great iconic albums. Marvin Gaye's 1971 classic, What's Going On? And the Beatles' 1967 classic, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Before I get to that though, last night I had an amazing time on the Sunset Strip in Hollywood to see Larry Dunn's anthology of Earth, Wind and Fire. They performed some of their great Earth, Wind and Fire songs. Everyone that knows me knows that Earth, Wind is my favorite band, and you can bet that I'm going to be featuring some of their great albums from the 70s in future episodes of the greatest albums of all time. But right now we are on album number 3 in my episodes of part 3 of the greatest albums of all time. And I'm going to feature an album today that does not necessarily is in the same pantheon as the great albums of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On in the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But this album here was a very important album in the way Motown Records evolved. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. As everyone knows, I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, grew up in Detroit, and I grew up during the time early in my life where Motown was synonymous with Detroit, Michigan, and probably the #1 record label as far as releasing great pop and R&B songs of the 60s. In fact, I think it could be said that the Beatles and Motown Records dominated the 1960s as far as great music that everyone loved. The Beatles, what they did differently was they took their album releases as seriously as they did their 45 releases. They put some great songs on their albums that were every bit as good, if not better, than the single releases. Motown really wasn't living like that. They were basically a singles 45 kind of outfit, and what they did, they released some great songs. But back in the 60s, albums were really kind of released as an afterthought. They were really meant more as a promotional vehicle to promote the single release. You know, album would be put haphazardly together, a collection of 8 or 9 songs, you know, that didn't have any thematic type of thing to it, and just kind of slapped some stuff on there. But it was basically released to promote the singles. The Beatles kind of changed all that when they started making great albums. And in 1967, probably, in my opinion, the first great album that was released by Motown Records was the album released by what many people called the all-time greatest R&B soul group. And that group is the Temptations. And the album they released in July 1967, near 50 years ago, was called With a Lot of Soul. And what made that album the album it was that it had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 songs that made the top 20 on the pop charts. And those songs were I Know I'm Losing You, All I Need, You're My Everything, and Loneliness Made Me Realize That I'm Losing You. And 3 of those songs, the first 3 songs, all made the top 10 on the Billboard pop charts, which was a first for Motown Records. The Temptations lineup of that period consisted of David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, Otis Williams, Paul Williams, and Melvin Franklin. What made the Temptations different from the other soul groups that Motown had? Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Martha and the Vandellas, the Supremes, the Four Tops, the Marvelettes. What made them different was that, unlike those other groups that basically had one lead singer, the Temptations had not one, not two, but three lead singers: Eddie Kendricks, David Ruffin, and Paul Williams. And truthfully speaking, Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin were no slouch either. They both got their turn in rare single cuts. But they boasted three great lead singers. David Ruffin was brought into the group in 1964. During that time, in the beginning, Eddie Kendricks was the dominant voice with their first big hit, The Way You Do Things You Do. In 1965, Smokey Robinson wrote the classic song My Girl, in which was David Ruffin's first lead vocal performance. It was the Temptations' first #1 hit on the pop charts, and it set in motion for the next 3 years, where David Ruffin was the main lead voice on all of their single cuts. And Motown wanted it that way. They wanted to feature David Ruffin. As some people may have learned about David Ruffin, if you ever read anything about the Temptations, he was a star, wanted to be a star, and he wanted to name the group David Ruffin and the Temptations. But because they were a Democratic group and who were primarily led by Otis Williams, they vetoed that. But Motown put David Ruffin out in front, and in 1967 they released an album, probably the best and biggest album of what they call the Classic Five era. And the Classic Five era was the group that included David Ruffin and the rest of those guys. I Know I'm Losing You, All I Need, You're My Everything, and Loneliness Made Me Realize I'm Losing You were great R&B songs that were amongst the best songs that Motown released in the 60s. And that was really the album that brought Norman Whitfield to prominence as a great Motown producer. Prior to that time, Smokey Robinson pretty much had a hold on the Temptations as far as producing them was concerned. But after Get Ready, the great song that it was did not go very far in the pop charts. Berry Gordy gave Norman Whitfield a chance, and he delivered with probably one of the greatest Motown songs ever recorded, a song that I feel truly defined the Motown Detroit sound of the 60s, and that's Ain't Too Proud to Beg. And he kept going big time with the 1967 release of With a Lot of Soul, which had 4 top 20 songs that had never been achieved by a Motown group to that point. And for anyone who ever wants to revisit that song, there's actually a song on there that has a rare lead by Otis Williams. Otis Williams, who basically formed the Temptations, is the only surviving member of that group. And he did a song on there called Don't Send Me Away. And it's actually a pretty good song. He had a pretty good voice. He certainly didn't have the range that David Ruffin or Paul Williams had, but it's actually not a bad song. So if you ever bring up that song on iTunes or anything, that album, listen to it. It's actually not a bad song. David Ruffin, as the more they became successful, the more isolated he became from the other Temptations, wanting to be the lead singer and doing a lot of other things, showing up late at concerts and being very much a prima donna until they were forced to fire David Ruffin. But I think they hired somebody pretty good to replace him, a guy named Dennis Edwards. And Dennis Edwards brought them to even bigger heights as they continued their amazing hit streak for the next 4 or 5 years, become an even bigger group than they were in the David Ruffin era. But in 1967, they released an album called With a Lot of Soul, and that album's going to be having its 50th anniversary in July of this year. It is my second favorite album of 1967, a year of great albums. And again, it's not the iconic album that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is, but it was probably the first album that was really truly a great album on Motown Records, and it laid the foundation for Marvin Gaye's 1971 masterpiece What's Going On, and all the great Stevie Wonder albums that followed in the 70s. But today, in episode 3 of the greatest albums of all time, I am featuring The Temptations with a Lot of Soul, released in July 1967 as one of the greatest albums of all time. Thank you all so much for watching my videos and subscribing to my YouTube channel and supporting me. I invite your comments. Check out some of my previous videos. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about what I'm saying. Maybe there's some people who've never heard that album, don't know anything about it, and want to listen to it, because it really was a great album, and it was the Temptations sounding at their very best, especially in the David Ruffin era. So I would recommend checking it out. This is L.A. Lim coming to you. I'm going to profile another album, the album from the 70s. Next week, so be looking for that. L.A. Lim telling you, as always, asking you as always to remember that love is life. Share love to your fellow human being. Be a blessing to someone today, and just share love, because love is the answer. This is L.A. Lim saying ciao bella. Ciao.